Ladies and gentlemen, can I begin today by welcoming you all to Cambridge. It's a great city, a great university, a great place. All of us here who've helped to organise this event really hope you have a tremendous time in this city. In the programme, which you can find online, there are detailed maps of walking tours and so on you can see for the various historic and touristic aspects of the city. But it's also a very exciting city with a lot of exciting people living and working here, thinking from all kinds of different directions. And it's that excitement which I think your conference brings to Cambridge. You are the people more than anyone in the world who are thinking about the great challenges, the history, the cultural aspects of the Baltic states. And you've come from all over the world to this event, and we absolutely celebrate your presence here. My name is Charles Clark. With Brendan Sims, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, we founded the Baltic Geopolitics program here at Cambridge University in January 2021. In your bags, you'll find a brochure about the program, but also feel free to ask any of us about what we've been trying to do. We did that because we felt that in the UK there is insufficient consideration of the current contemporary challenges in the Baltic states and the Baltic Sea region in general, and we wanted to build what we are doing. We've now had more than 90 different events, some online, some here in Cambridge, some at various places around the Baltic Sea region, and we have a network of 20 universities, many of you who are here today, in our Baltic Geopolitics network, with whom we have tried to work over this time. For us, this conference is the culmination of that work. And I'll say a word or two about Donatas Kupsiunas in a moment, but he deserves enormous credit for bringing this conference here. There's a whole series of people I need to thank. I want to thank our sponsors, Staynerline and DNK, for helping us with the finance of what we're doing. I want to thank the AABS in particular, and I'll introduce its president in just a second, but it's made the whole event entirely possible. I want to thank the team working at the Baltic Geopolitics program, the Centre for Geopolitics, many of you in the room who've worked unbelievably hard to try and make all of this whole event work as smoothly as possible. It's been a tribute to a whole set of people, and I hope and I'm confident that we will succeed in having a very positive event. I want to thank all of our sponsors. As I said, I mentioned those two, but also the British Latvian Association, the British Lithuanian Association, for the support which they have given. So I want to emphasize, before introducing George Hackman, that we are at your disposal over these 3 days. There is an amazing range of events taking place. If you have queries, comments, questions you'd like to raise, please raise them with us, and we'll try and take them into account in what we do. So without further ado, I want to introduce George Hackman, who is the president of the Association of Baltic States. He is from Stettin University. He's played a dynamic role in everything that we've done. In fact, Brendan and I had a very good set of meetings in Stettin last year with the NATO commanders who are based in Stettin for a very good seminar with the university there. He's a very distinguished scholar in this field, and we're absolutely delighted to invite you to welcome the delegates on behalf of the AABS. George Hackman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles, for this very nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear attendees of this year's Baltic Studies Conference, on behalf of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 16th already Conference on Baltic Studies in Europe. AEBS has been organizing biannual Baltic Studies Conference in Northern America since 1968, but for several years it has become increasingly involved in supporting and co-organizing the European conferences taking place every other year. This year, AEBS was able to fund 12 travel grants for emerging scholars to attend this conference, and I'm sure AEBS will continue the cooperation with the organizers of the following CBSE conferences. Initiatives for organizing Baltic Studies conferences started around 1970 in the US by AEBS, and in Europe first in Sweden by the Baltic Institute in Stockholm. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the restored independence of the three Baltic states, the first biennial CBSE conference was held in Riga in 1995 and then followed by conference alternating between venues in the three Baltic states and the wider Baltic Sea region. This year, for the first time, the conference takes place outside the Baltic Sea region, and this highlights how the relevance of Baltic studies has grown in recent years. It is obvious that there are many very good reasons to organize CBSE at Cambridge, but first of all, the initiative and the efforts of the Center for Geopolitics and the Baltic Geopolitics program led by Charles Clark must be mentioned here. And of course, the incredible work of Donatas Kupčūnas, who is the main person behind organizing of the conference. I think he already deserves warm applause. In fact, coming together here at Cambridge fits into a broader picture of Baltic studies. Since its beginnings in the Cold War, it has always been shaped by scholarly entanglements across the Baltic and the Atlantic. And many of the activities of AEBS, not least the editorial work of its Journal of Baltic Studies, take place in Europe. Starting with the conference in Turku in 2003, Baltic Studies has increasingly broadened its scope towards the wider Baltic Sea region against the insight that the three Baltic states and societies form an important node in a wider network. The logic behind this expansion may be described with a statement by the American-Estonian historian Rein Taagepera. Remaining too narrowly in our area of highest national expertise guarantees us against mistakes and against relevance. Today, however, we might find ourselves in an opposite situation with increased public interest and political demands stimulated by the current crisis and the all-embracing securitization of Baltic studies. Thus, we are indeed and once again at converging paths, connecting our expertise in Baltic studies to the political, social, and educational demands of the current situation. Looking at the impressive number of remarkably interesting topics to be discussed in the following days at this conference, one might end with an optimistic view on the new global attractiveness of Baltic studies. However, in a period of constant disruptions and uncertainties, one should say that it is our task to make relevant answers heard that the Baltic states can give to the challenges we are currently facing in Europe and beyond. So I wish you a fruitful and inspiring discussions here at Cambridge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Georg. I should have emphasized at the beginning that we are filming all of this event. The film will go on our website in the next few days. It's not going out live, but people should be aware of that as they contribute to the event. And I should also just say we've got a number of journalists who've been kind enough to come to the event and will cover it in various ways. And so you should be aware that there is a potential wider audience for anything that you say. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Donatas Kupčūnas. He's been mentioned before, but he was appointed as the Baltic Research Fellow for our Center for Geopolitics shortly after we were founded in late 2021. He's played an outstanding role in our center, making it exist at all really, and take it forward, and has provided an intellectual ballast for the whole way in which the organization is developed. Many of you here will know him and will know of his outstanding leadership and his warmth and friendship in all respects. As far as this event's concerned, as George said, he has played a decisive role from his attendance at previous events to really try and see if we could have this in Cambridge. He's worked unbelievably hard on the program and all other aspects. He's been supported by a strong team from our centre, but it's Donatus' leadership which has brought us to this point. So I'm now going to ask Donatus to say a couple of words about how the event's transpiring, how you can fit in with it, and how it will go before I introduce our keynote speaker, Donatus Kupsiunas.
Thank you, Charles. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see so many of you here in body and soul. When we say that it's unprecedented, all of this, we really mean it. We're not making this up. I mean, Cambridge hasn't seen that many bolts in one go for maybe 1,000 years, ever since they separated from Oxford or something. Yesterday at about 6 p.m., my colleagues from the Fitzwilliam House were sending me pictures and messages from the top floor of the Fitzwilliam House overlooking this little blue entrance, saying something, you know, they're coming. Your bolts, they're coming. All of them, 600 of them, you know, it's growing, the queue is growing. God help us all. So we're all a bit excited about this, and we hope that you're going to have a great time here. Now, just a few notes on housekeeping. 129 panels, ladies and gentlemen, 3 plenary lectures, and much, much more. So there'll be plenty for everyone to check out. As you may know, we're based in 4 locations in this conference. So one of them is here. The other one is at Peterhouse College, which is just 5 minutes from here. And then we have 2 which are ARB, or the Political Science Building, and also the English faculty, and they're just near each other. So the main point here is, let's say if you have a presentation or a panel here, and if you need to walk to chair a panel in ARB or in the English faculty, just make sure that you leave immediately, because it takes about 16 minutes to walk from here to the ARB or the English faculty. There is also a reception tonight. Everyone is welcome. There will be hot food and wine and drinks, so make sure not to miss it. If something doesn't work here or anywhere in this country, in Blighty, you know, just please consider that it probably hasn't been working for the last 1,000 years anyway. So just have a cup of tea if you can find it, keep calm and carry on. Thank you very much.
And just to add, there are a couple of special events during the course of these 2 or 3 days, which I think the tickets are now all gone. But there's an event at Duxford, the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, tomorrow evening, where Air Marshal Ed Stringer is going to talk about the Baltic Sea and the RAF, and the Air Museum is a very exciting place. And then we have our gala dinner on Saturday at King's College, which is a very splendid venue. It's a great, great pleasure to introduce Brendan Sims, Professor Brendan Sims. Brendan is the animating idea behind the Centre for Geopolitics in Cambridge. He is an outstanding historian, particularly of Europe and also of Germany as well, within Europe. He is an untypical academic. I see most academics, I'm sure nobody in this room, as rather conservative and conventional in the way they operate. But Brendan has always been ready to push the boundaries to take things further forward, which in my view is the true historic role of an academic, is to ask questions, to address challenges and so on. I've enjoyed working with him immensely over these 4 years in getting this program to succeed. His own driving influence on history has been at the core of what we do. We've been of the view you can't look at contemporary geopolitical and other questions other than with the benefit of understanding the history. And I'd say that's more true in the Baltic than almost anywhere else that one can think of. He's a great man, and I'm really looking forward to hearing him talk about Britain and the geopolitics of the Baltic. Professor Brendan Sims.
Well, thank you very much, Charles, for those kind remarks. It's a great honor to open this 16th conference of the Baltic Studies in Europe. I actually haven't spoken to such a large and distinguished audience before, so I'm somewhat trepidatious about it, but it's a great privilege and, as I say, a great honor. So in this lecture, I'll be speaking to a forthcoming book written by Center for Geopolitics Assistant Director Dr. Hugo Bromley and myself, entitled British Statecraft and the Geopolitics of the Baltic, a Documentary History, and Hugo is here in the front row. This in turn arises out of the Baltic Geopolitics program, which Charles Clarke mentioned, which I lead with him here at Cambridge, and it also arises out of the MPhil course I gave together with Hugo and indeed with Donatas Kupčiūnas, whom of course you all know as he organized this conference. Now I'd like to start with an arresting fact, one that I think you're all now familiar with, but was for quite a long time little discussed. Today, Britain's front line is on the Baltic, and in effect has been really since the Russian illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, and shortly after when Britain committed to sending troops to Estonia. But this deployment gained even greater importance, of course, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Britain has committed to that front line and must commit not just out of self-interest or a desire for favorable trade, but because I think it understands that Europe is, as my great fellow Irishman Edmund Burke put it 300 years ago, quote, a vast commonwealth whose freedom is maintained by the fundamental principle of national sovereignty and the inviolability of borders. Today, Russian imperialism threatens that principle, and with it, Britain itself. Now, nobody would have predicted this even 20 years ago, still less in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. But perhaps they should have done, because as we shall see, Britain has periodically committed itself to the security of the Baltic Sea region in ways that had dramatic consequences. For example, in 1919 and 1939, and at other times declined to do so, for example, in 1772, with equally momentous results. So this is all part of a much wider history. And so the theme of my lecture can be expressed in two simple propositions. The first is that the Baltic Sea region has mattered historically to the United Kingdom. Secondly, the United Kingdom historically has exercised a powerful geopolitical influence on the Baltic Sea region by guaranteeing or failing to guarantee the independence of sovereign states in the region against Russian or German imperialism. This effort was first conceived by the thinkers of the 18th century before undergoing a crisis in the Napoleonic Wars that heralded a century of imperial retreat, only for Versailles to revive it under the guise of self-determination, culminating in Britain's commitment to Poland before World War II, and the NATO guarantee after that that defines Britain's relationship with the region today. Since Versailles, America's commitment to the principle of territorial integrity and state sovereignty has often wavered, and perhaps does so today, even as Britain's has strengthened. So I'm going to divide my lecture into 5 parts. First of all, the emergence of a British national interest in the Baltic. Secondly, on the Napoleonic Wars. Part 3 will be on the establishment of the Baltic states in 1919. Part 4 will be on the guarantee to Poland in 1939. And the 5th part will be on NATO and the post-war security guarantee. So let's begin with the emergence of the Baltic as a national interest in the 17th and 18th centuries. Although Britain's relationship with the Baltic Sea region stretches back at least to the time of Bede and Alfred, the Baltic only began to become a key factor in English statecraft at the beginning of the 17th century. And here I think there were 2 drivers. The first was the role of Germany, which English strategists saw as the key bulwark against the Habsburg threat and their own liberties. Under the reign of Gustavus Adolphus, in particular, Military victories in Poland and Livonia had established Sweden as the dominant power in the Baltic Sea region. This made Sweden a potentially vital support for the Protestant cause in Germany, particularly during the 30 Years' War. So supporting Sweden meant supporting the Protestant cause in Germany, and supporting the Protestant cause in Germany defended England. The second driver was economic. As the states of the region increasingly established their authority over trade, English merchants were able to compete directly with the old Hanseatic League by appealing directly to the political authority of the sovereign. So English statecraft mixed a reliance on supporting the mercantile community, shaped by the petitions and requests of the merchants themselves, with a desire to enlist Swedish forces on behalf of the Protestant cause in Europe, which would ultimately be funded by the very trade England sought to nourish. And epitomizing this delicate balancing act was the embassy of Sir Thomas Roe, sent to Poland in 1625 to negotiate a treaty between Poland and Sweden that would facilitate Sweden's intervention in the 30 Years' War. The Treaty of Altmark was eventually concluded in 1629. In the end, Gustavus's great German campaigns were financed by the taxes on Riga, seized from Poland as part of the settlement, and revenue from the Sound tolls. So before and after the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, England saw Swedish strength as an essential element of a pro-Protestant foreign policy that sought to protect the autonomy of the Protestant German princes. The parliamentarian leader, Oliver Cromwell, from close by these parts, even remarked that England and Sweden were, quote, the two columns of the Protestant cause on the continent, and a combination of the Royal Navy and Swedish land power together, quote, might hold Europe in subjection. Now, the Great Northern War at the start of the 18th century saw British interests begin to reckon for the first time with the capacity for Russian expansion to undermine state sovereignty in Europe. When Charles II of Sweden marched to his defeat at Poltava in 1709, he was accompanied by the British envoy, William Jeffreys. His letter after the battle makes for astonishing reading, and we have it here on a slide. Jeffreys writes to the Secretary of State, "I need not mention the great projects the Muscovites have planned to extend their dominions to the East Sea, the Baltic, all along the Dnieper, over Crimea, and from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. Their vast design to enlarge their shipping and commerce, their more than human endeavors to root themselves where once they get footing, are things which I humbly lay before your honor, who will best be able to judge whether these projects are consistent with the balance Her Majesty and her glorious predecessors have always maintained among the princes of Europe." So a very clear British interest is being articulated here. And this anxiety increased after 1714, when the accession of George I, of course also Elector of Hanover, brought Britain into dynastic union with Hanover in northern Germany. As Peter the Great of Russia pushed further and further west in an effort to force Sweden to come to terms, Britain deployed a Royal Navy squadron to the Baltic under Admiral Norris. The deployment of Russian troops to Germany, to Mecklenburg, as was feared at the time, would, in the words of the then Secretary of State, Earl Stanhope, quote, light a fire in the middle of the empire, of course, the Holy Roman Empire of Germany, again, a vital British interest. The decades after the end of the Great Northern War saw intermittent European conflicts over the balance of power, usually triggered by the succession crises in one or other major state, most notably Poland, Lithuania, and Austria, sitting alongside continuing Anglo-French rivalry over maritime supremacy. It was at this point that British statesmen began to develop the concept we know today as the balance of power. This was premised not on the domination of a few great powers, but a wider system of diplomacy that would preserve the sovereignty of sovereign states against what they called universal monarchy. This system was to be guaranteed not by simple force, but by the maintenance of a system of alliances and treaties, guaranteed ultimately, of course, by military intervention. In the thinking of writers such as Edmund Burke and David Hume, this balance would both guarantee the British Constitution and foster a wider Commonwealth of Europe, which would allow liberty to flourish across the continent. Here you see Edmund Burke on this very topic. No sooner, though, had this thinking been developed than the 1772 partition of Poland by Catherine II of Russia, Frederick II of Prussia, and Maria Theresa of Austria struck at its root, and Britain did nothing. There was a brief discussion, but Britain decided not to intervene. There was perhaps nothing it could do, constrained by distance and by the alignment of Russia, Prussia, and Austria against the ailing Polish-Lithuanian state. Yet the advocates of the balance of power were well aware of what the crisis meant. I quote here Edmund Burke, "The present violent dismemberment and partition of Poland, without the pretense of war or even the color of right, is to be considered the first very great breach in the modern political system of Europe, of that security which was founded in treaties, alliances, common interest, and public faith." So inaction in 1772 also had its consequences. Let me now turn to the Napoleonic Wars. The Baltic also featured prominently during this period, on at least two occasions. The first issue was the future of neutrality. British economic statecraft had already led to the confrontation with Russia and the Scandinavian states earlier in the century, as the neutral Baltic resisted British efforts to interdict global trade. In late 1800, matters came to a head when Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Denmark formed the Second Armed Neutrality and excluded all British ships from trading with the Baltic. This was in retaliation for London's insistence of the right to search on the high seas. Shortly after, in mid-January 1801, the British government responded by placing an embargo on all Danish, Russian, and Swedish ships in British ports. 3 months later, the Prussians occupied Hanover, of which, of course, King George III was elector, in order to put pressure on the British. By then, though, the British had decided to force the issue by taking radical action against the League at its weakest point. London picked on Denmark, a small power to be sure, but far from an insignificant one. Territorially, of course, it included Norway, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, and the two German provinces of Schleswig-Holstein. Geopolitically, Denmark controlled access between the Baltic and the North Sea, either through the Sound or the Great and Little Belts to the west. Last but not least, the Danish fleet was the 5th largest in the world. So in 1801, a British force commanded by Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, with Horatio Nelson as second in command, engaged the Danish reserve fleet in Copenhagen roads and defeated it. The Royal Navy prepared to bombard Copenhagen itself if Nelson's negotiations proved unsuccessful. But the death of the Russian Tsar, Paul, the leader of the League, allowed a compromise to be reached. Now, the attack on Denmark in 1801 provoked some controversy in Britain. Its defenders justified the mission as a measure necessary to maintain the British maritime supremacy, on which they believed the European balance rested. One judge, justifying British searches of neutral vessels, he justified it by reaching back to the legendary German jurist Samuel von Pufendorf, who held, in an earlier time, that because Louis XIV threatened, quote, Europe with slavery and the Protestant religion with destruction, some, quote, greedy merchants could not be allowed to profit by it. So state sovereignty, the British argued here, must be undermined to preserve the system on which that sovereignty was based. So it's a paradox. Full-scale war broke out again between Britain and France in 1803. After defeating the Austrians, Russians, and Prussians in Central Europe, Napoleon advanced to the Baltic and, with some difficulty, crushed the Prussian and Russian armies there by the middle of 1807. Denmark was once again in the frame. Her ability and willingness to resist French demands was extremely doubtful. The most important issue was the future, though, of the Danish fleet. This was still the fifth largest navy in Europe, behind only that of Britain, France, Spain, and Russia. If it fell into French hands, it could tip the global maritime balance. So the Baltic again became the epicenter of British strategy. The government decided to send an expedition to Copenhagen as an exercise in prevention, preemption, and deterrence. So this is a second expedition sent in 1807. They believed that Denmark was close to surrendering its fleet to Napoleon, and that even if that were not the case, the danger of this happening at some future date warranted taking anticipatory action. The British government also hoped that firm measures against the Danes would deter others, in particular Tsarist Russia. When Denmark refused the British ultimatum, British forces embarked on the indiscriminate shelling of civilians. In all, about 6,000 projectiles were fired at Copenhagen, killing about 200 civilians. The damage to the city was relatively concentrated, encompassing about 10 streets. But the risk was that the fires would spread, so the Danes gave way and agreed to hand over their fleet. The attack provoked a lively debate inside Britain. It turned on the nature of neutrality, the law of nations, and whether Britain had the right to attack neutral nations in self-defense. The government justified its actions with reference to the unique threat of Napoleonic France and the necessity of compromising international law in pursuit of preserving the wider international system. 7 years later, in 1815, at the end of the wars, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, who had also supported the Copenhagen expedition as Secretary of War, led Britain's acquiescence in an imperial system in Eastern Europe at the Congress of Vienna. 25 years of incessant conflict with France in Europe and the extraordinary role of Russia in France's eventual defeat led to a fundamental shift in how peace would be pursued in Europe and in the Baltic Sea region in particular. If Vienna worked on a balance of power framework at all, it did so through the creation of a fundamentally static European system maintained by imperial power. The opposite, you might think, of Burke's vision of a Europe evolving towards liberty. At Vienna, Castlereagh prioritized security against France ahead of a more liberal settlement across Europe, particularly in Poland. Castlereagh opposed Alexander's initial plan to reconstitute the entirety of Poland as a theoretically independent state in dynastic union with Russia. Alexander proposed to do this by effectively pushing the concept of the Polish partition further west, compensating Prussia for the loss of its Polish territories with the whole of Saxony. The problem was that the only way to oppose this was to act in concert with France, not something that Britain was prepared to do more than contemplate, at least at this point. Alexander eventually compromised, largely out of a desire not to wreck the relationship he had built with Austria. However, Poland remained divided between the powers, and the liberties Alexander granted to Congress Poland did not last long. So I turn now to part 3, the establishment of Poland and the Baltic states after the First World War. The Vienna settlement acted as a roadblock against Britain supporting liberal constitutionalism in Europe, even as political rights advanced at home. For the next half-century, British Whigs and Prime Minister Viscount Palmerston, in particular, sought to advance liberal constitutionalism abroad, but shied away from military intervention that might overturn the wider Vienna settlement. During the Polish rebellions of 1831 and 63, Britain offered moral support, but nothing more. Vienna, one liberal Whig complained, had seen, quote, the aggrandizement of the greater powers at the expense of the lesser. In all these cases, Britain opposed Tsarist Russia, but its only conflict with that power, the Crimean War, was provoked by issues in the Black Sea rather than the Baltic. And Palmerston's ideal outcome of that war, as he called it, in other words, the return of Sweden and the establishment of an independent Poland, were illusory. Then, from 1871, the establishment of the German Empire intersected with the growing political significance of Britain's own imperialism to create a new dynamic in British politics. Now, Britain's commitment to state sovereignty was revived by its commitment to total victory in the First World War. Partly this was a consequence of America's entry and Woodrow Wilson's commitment to self-determination and the establishment of a Polish state with access to the sea. But it also reflected the revival of a particular strand of British political thought. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, had been denounced as a Little England opponent of empire earlier in his career, particularly during the Boer War. However, Lloyd George had been crucial in mobilizing liberal support for the war, largely on the issue of German violation of Belgian neutrality and the rights of small nations. After becoming Prime Minister, he came under increasing pressure to set out his war aims. In his Caxton Hall speech in January 1918, which you see here, Lloyd George explicitly rejected the old imperial system. I quote, "The days of the Treaty of Vienna are long gone, past. We can no longer submit the future of European civilization to the arbitrary decision of a few negotiators." Now, the collapse of the three Eastern empires, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, at the end of the war, left the southern and eastern shores of the Baltic at the end of a geopolitical vacuum, with nationalist movements in Finland, the Baltic states, and Poland. The two most active figures in British policy, though, were primarily interested in the region for its proximity to other issues. Winston Churchill, who held the most extreme anti-Soviet position possible as Secretary of War, worked closely with Russian émigrés and white Russian communities that refused to accept even the notion of Polish independence, let alone that of Latvia or Estonia. Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon, who did see Poland as a major actor, was looking even further afield, still stuck in the pre-1914 world of the Great Game, and seeking to weaken Russia in Central Asia so as to reduce the threat to British India. Now, initially, after the First World War, the British response to the Baltic vacuum was to commit small military forces to support the independence movements of the region, while backing every non-Soviet military organization it could find. The most famous initiative here was the dispatch of the two naval squadrons to support Estonian and later Latvian independence, in a move that is still remembered today. The Foreign Office committed in September 1918 to prevent a foreign government being imposed on Estonia without its consent. However, most in government focused on relations with the White Russians during the Civil War and the future non-communist Russia after it, which it hoped would be a responsible stakeholder in the international order, including the emerging League of Nations. Although the restoration of Poland was seen as inevitable, there was in fact widespread skepticism at the viability of the Baltic states. I quote here Sir Henry Wilson, another Irishman, in early 1919. He says, I quote, "Look at those two little plots on the map and look at all that enormous country, Russia, beside them. How can they hope to avoid being gobbled up?" He was then the chief of the Imperial General Staff. How can they avoid being gobbled up? The fundamental problem was that Britain was committed rhetorically to self-determination, but unwilling to actually commit military forces to sustain it. The Baltic states were therefore left as an open question at Versailles to be decided by the League. Britain's Polish policy was similarly confused. Britain supported the new concept of a plebiscite or referendum to determine Poland's borders. The challenge was Danzig on the Baltic, which was left as a defensive free city under League supervision. Given the city's German population, Lloyd George personally rejected the idea that Poland should be allowed to fortify the city. This confusion continued through the Polish-Soviet War. Britain opposed Pilsudski's federalist ambitions, and advocates of the League of Nations called on Lord Curzon as Foreign Secretary to prevent the conflict. The British government's efforts at mediation led to the famous Curzon Line, which would later become the basis for the Polish border agreed at Yalta and later at Potsdam. When Poland then turned to seize Vilnius from neutral Lithuania, Britain considered expelling Poland from the League, but shied away from doing so, and in the end accepted the fait accompli. The great expert on the Vilnius question is Donatas Kupčiūnas here in the front row. In short, the immediate post-war period saw Britain play a vital role in establishing the independence of the Baltic states. However, as long as Britain did not commit to defending that settlement, either with its own forces or by strengthening the military capabilities of the new nations, it ultimately rested on Soviet and military and German forbearance, which of course did not last very long. Now, the failure of the Versailles settlement and Britain's role in its collapse through a policy of appeasement is a well-known story. In March 1939, Germany seized Memel from Lithuania and made a public demand for the restoration of Danzig. At this time, increasingly, the Liberal and Labour parties were moving to embrace the concept of collective security among European states against German aggression. For many on the left, particularly in the Labour Party, this would fall under the aegis of the League of Nations. The Prime Minister Chamberlain shied away from the concept itself, still concerned about the risk of open commitments. However, he and the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, eventually agreed with the French government to issue a limited security guarantee to Poland as an interim step towards a wider agreement. The declaration marked, in Chamberlain's words, quote, a new point, I would say a new epoch in the course of our foreign policy. For the first time, Britain was committed to the independence of Poland as a national interest of sufficient significance to risk conflict. Nearly 2 centuries after Burke had first argued that British liberty could not withstand a sovereign nation of Poland's scale being wiped off the map by great powers, British foreign policy had moved to defend this theory in practice. Yet, the commitment was limited in scope and widely regarded as not credible. Britain's new epoch was hesitant and, above all, late. No serious planning was undertaken to defend Poland beyond a vague commitment to bombing German strategic industry. Britain's guarantee simply came too late to create a national or international system to support Poland. Unable to project force through the Baltic, thanks to the risk of Denmark mining the Sound and Belt under German pressure, support would have had to come indirectly through Romania. On the 1st of September 1939, the Westerplatte outside Danzig saw the first shots of the Second World War. It is the ultimate irony of the interwar period that Britain was brought into European conflict after an attack on a city they had specifically stripped of all fortification against German attack during the peace negotiations 20 years before. Its commitment to territorial integrity had come too late for Poland and the Baltic Sea region as a whole. Now, Stalin followed his attack on Poland in 1939 by an attack on Finland later that year and by occupying the Baltic states in the summer of 1940. At that time, the British War Cabinet wrestled with the difficulty of simultaneously accepting Soviet aggression in the Baltic while attempting to build support in America on the basis of resistance to Soviet expansion. So let's now turn to the construction of the post-World War II order. In the last 80 years, the structures established between 1945 and 1950 have taken on such a solidity that it is difficult to understand how uncertain the organization of Europe was at the time, both for Britain and the states of the Baltic Sea region. Internal Foreign Office deliberations opposed even planning for a potential clash with the Soviet Union, putting their faith in the world government of the United Nations. 2 major turning points brought Britain and its American ally to view the Soviet Union as a potential adversary. The first was the collapse of cooperation over Germany, culminating in the Berlin blockade. The second, equally important, was the Soviet bloc's collective rejection of Marshall aid, which was cited by Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin as public proof of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Atlanticists, including Bevan, were thereby able to overcome the internal opponents who advocated a European third way between the USA and the USSR. The establishment of NATO was a lesson in the management of American politics. First, the White House had to be convinced at a time when many of the leading architects of containment in the United States, especially George Kennan, were initially opposed. Kennan in particular was concerned that not only had Europe, quote, mistaken what was essentially a political threat for a military one, NATO would include a number of countries, recipients of Marshall aid, outside the core Euro-Atlantic area. However, President Truman and Aitchison, then the Secretary of State, were much more sympathetic. And even Kennan came to accept that only a security guarantee could reassure Europe sufficiently to hold the continent together. Britain then persuaded the US administration to accept a single North Atlantic organization that included Canada, rather than separating the European and North Atlantic spheres. The Senate, however, proved a far more challenging task, and both the White House and Bevan, working through an outstanding ambassador in Sir Oliver Franks, threw themselves into negotiations. The greatest tension, interestingly enough, came over the language of Article 5. Congress was afraid that the guarantee would see it lose its authority over the declaration of war. One senator, Tom Connally of Texas, attempted to remove the famous commitment, quote, that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Bevan joined with Truman in opposing the amendments, stating clearly that he would not sign unless America accepted the principle, quote, of conception of an Atlantic community as one fundamental unit which has got to be defended together for the sake of all its parts, as he put it to Aitchison. And eventually Senator Connally gave way. NATO was and remains the fulfillment of Edmund Burke's vision, cited at the start of this lecture, a European, now a North Atlantic Commonwealth, sustained above all by a collective commitment to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of its members. Under the leadership of successive Secretaries General, beginning with the legendary Lord Imey, practical military cooperation was enhanced, primarily as a pathway to strengthening the political relationship and trust between the various militaries in a way that would strengthen their commitment against external attack. So to conclude, it is vital, I think, that academics and policymakers alike understand this history today. In the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, Poland joined NATO, and a few years later, the three Baltic states followed. Britain, in fact, had been initially hesitant, as at that time all states sought a political settlement that would avoid an atmosphere of conflict. I quote here the then Secretary of State for Defense, Malcolm Rifkind, says in 1994, none of these states, quote, would want to create a confrontational posture involving the forward stationing of forces in their countries and a military tripwire. But that mindset, which made sense in the context of the 1990s, has been changing since Russia's 2014 seizure of Crimea. Britain pushed for the creation of the enhanced forward presence at the 2014 Wales Summit, while the Joint Expeditionary Force, originally conceived as a vehicle for coordinating emergency humanitarian efforts, was reconceived as a vehicle for closer cooperation on Baltic security, including with Sweden and Finland before they joined NATO. NATO defense planning turned back towards the risk of Russian imperialism. Since the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, collective security has been strengthened further by the admission of Sweden and Finland into NATO. Britain must now recognize that collective security in Europe as part of a community of sovereign states, a vast commonwealth, in Burke's phrase, is under unprecedented threat. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, if allowed to succeed, risks becoming the first step in a wider return to revanchism and conflict. The partitions of Poland 3 centuries ago heralded a general shift towards disorder and chaos in Europe. In such a world, states are forced to make appalling choices to preserve their independence, as Britain infamously did when it acted at Copenhagen in 1807. It is only through a universal commitment to resist territorial aggression in its near abroad that Britain and the Baltic Sea region alike can avoid a world of autocracy and violence in Europe again. It is impossible not to recognize that Donald Trump's election and the resulting transformation of American attitudes to Europe changes what that commitment means. It means a radical increase in British defense expenditure, particularly on logistical operations, and closer cooperation among other NATO members. It means addressing the question, the homework, if you like, that Sir Henry Wilson posed so starkly after World War I. How do we stop the Baltic states from being, as he put it, gobbled up? The Baltic Sea region is Britain and Europe's front line, but it is not our limit. We must continue to support Ukraine, in part because if we do not, Ukraine today may well become the Baltic tomorrow. This is what Britain's envoy to Charles XII, William Jeffreys, feared more than 300 years ago. His warning, which I cited at the start of this lecture, was soon vindicated in the 18th century. Bearing this deep historical context in mind, I hope one outcome of this conference, hosted for the first time here in Cambridge, will be to build closer relationships between Britain and the Baltic Sea region. That in itself would be a great achievement in this uncertain world. Thank you very much.
Stay there, Brendan. Excellent. I think you'd all agree that that was a magisterial start to our conference. The themes that Brendan has talked about will recur through the next 3 days in various of the panels. And I know Brendan himself, but all of us will be very interested to see different inputs onto the thinking which Brendan's described. We started a few minutes late, so I'm going to stop at 10:10, which before adjourning this to go to future sessions. That means we've got about 10 or 11 minutes for questions. So if you'd like to indicate, and Brendan, why don't you just stay here and I'll pick people who'd like to ask any questions or make any observations. Gentleman there, could you just tell us what your name and organisation is, please?
Yeah, thank you. So the mic came here. My name is Mars Sanjans. I work for Center for Geopolitical Studies in Riga. Thank you very much for this conference. The venue is excellent, speakers are excellent, your lecture was excellent. Thank you very much. You spoke about the Napoleonic Wars, and it's well known that the British Army currently is probably the smallest since the beginning of Napoleonic Wars. So it's less than 70,000 men and women at arms, and it's not only about the manpower, it's also about, armament, so forth. So British Army is not in a good shape. Do you have any lessons from history that could lead us to understand on how the British military could evolve for the next few years? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. The British Army, immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, was a historic low. Actually, most of them, or a great many of them, were Irish at that time. But the lesson, I think, is that Britain starts from a low and unsatisfactory position and then expands to much greater effectiveness. That's what happened. There was then war against Russia, Crimean War, which started very badly but ultimately ended in victories. First, Second World War, there's a long list of such conflicts. My anxiety is just that if we are not sufficiently prepared, and you're quite right, we are not yet sufficiently prepared, we're better prepared than we were even 5 years ago, but if we are not, then a price will be paid at the start of a conflict which could have been deterred, a price which is not necessary. And that if effective deterrence can be delivered now through greater investment, as was delivered by NATO throughout the Cold War, actually the most effective military operation ever without firing a shot within Europe, then I think the danger is that if the investment is not made, a much greater amount of blood and treasure will have to be expended at a later stage.
Thank you. Next question, please. Yes, there's a gentleman up in the back there.
Thanks. Damian Szacawa, Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Poland, the Institute of Central Europe. Professor, I have a question to you. How would you react to recent attempts to negotiate the peace in Ukraine, taking into account that it was at low level and taking into account the Lloyd George British national interest aims and this quote that you made? Thanks.
Well, I think like many people, I'm extremely concerned by what one hears, because it appears to amount to a suggestion that annexation should be recognized not only de facto, but de jure. So Edmund Burke, were he standing up here, would react, I think, very violently to that. And I think he would also suggest that that will not be the end of it. It will not lead to the outcome which is desired, and in particular, it will risk the security of the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and the High North. And my follow-on anxiety from that is that if there's to be a deployment of a peacekeeping force or any other kind of force with British involvement to Ukraine, it would risk fixing that force in Ukraine while neutralizing the Ukrainians, who are the most effective force in Europe at the moment, and divert that force from the defense of the Baltic and the High North. So I think there are many, many perils in the situation confronting us today.
Thank you, Brendan. Going to be able to have 2 or 3 more questions, I think. Can't see none. Gentleman over there, please.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Samuel Kramer from St. Andrews. I want to thank you for your magisterial presentation. And I wanted to go back to the first slide you showed us about Charles XII and the Hanoverians' early policies toward the Baltic Sea region. I'm aware that Britain in that time switched, in a way, sides, initially being more sympathetic to Russia, but then after the Russian Empire began gaining ground, it switched toward subtly supporting Sweden's position. Could that be seen as the beginning of an effort to create a balance of power in the region so that no one side had absolute control over the Baltic?
Thank you. Yes, it's definitely part of that balance of power policy that you have outlined. And another factor that should be mentioned, which I didn't, is the importance at that time in the 18th century of the Baltic as a source of naval stores. So the Royal Navy was hugely dependent on masts, hemp, other products that came not necessarily from the Baltic, but through the Baltic to Britain. So, if you like, it was a kind of critical supply chain, as we would say today, for the Royal Navy. Hugo Bromley actually has quite a lot to say about the economic statecraft interest in that period. So maybe you might like to add a word or two?
Thank you, Brendan. Hi, everyone. We're all running around and taking strange positions on the stage today, aren't we? The only thing I would add is that what balance of power meant changed and evolved over the course of the 18th century in a way that political theorists, historians of political thought now are only beginning to recognize. Certainly that switch in Admiral Norris's squadron from Sweden to Russia had profound implications. But what Brendan and I highlighted there, what Brendan highlighted so well in his lecture, is the emergence of a more positive vision of balance of power, based not on simply squaring off great powers against each other, but finding an international system in Europe that would facilitate not only the sovereignty of small states, but their constitutional evolution. That idea grows over the course of the 18th century, and I think is really important to think about today.
Thank you, Hugo. The book that Hugo is working on with Brendan is one of a group of 4 or 5 books which our centre is publishing in the course of this year and the beginning of next year. We're gradually developing our academic input in this, which will, I hope, contribute to debate. I've got time for one more question. Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you. Hello, I'm John Psaropoulos from Al Jazeera. There's a lot of discussion these days about Gaullist autonomy versus British Atlanticism. Is there a historic verdict on that now that American commitment is again, as in the days of Ernest Bevin, in doubt?
Thanks, John. Can you all hear me? I think I'm mic'd up. It's a good question. So I suppose the historic verdict is not a hugely encouraging one, but it would be that for most of the time over history, Britain has defended the European balance and its own interests without American support. Obviously, American support in the 20th century was critical, but there are many, many centuries before that, against Louis XIV, against Napoleon, and so on and so forth. And even the first 2 years of the Second World War were fought without direct American support. The Americans only entered the Second World War in Europe, as in Asia, because they were attacked at Pearl Harbor, and then subsequently Hitler declared war on the United States, not the other way around. Whereas Britain proactively joined the Second World War to defend the European balance. So these historically are different starting points. So I'm afraid it is possible today that it may have to be done without the Americans. I still think that is a bleak view, and I still cling to the hope that it may not be necessary. But we have to assume the worst. But the good news is that Britain is not alone. It is together with many other countries, particularly those of the Baltic Sea region. And so the reason why I gave the lecture I did was to show the way in which Britain has been connected with the Baltic Sea region and how important the defense of the balance in the Baltic Sea region is to the security of this country, long before the Americans appeared on the scene and possibly for some time after they leave it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Brendan. As I said earlier, I think yours is a magisterial lecture that sets the context for the whole of this conference outstandingly well. And I'm sure all of us will want to thank you for the lecture that you've given. Thank you very much.